I'd like to thank you for participating in the Space Walk of Fame's Oral History Project. And before we actually begin the interview, if you'd please state your full name and any other names that you might be known by.
Well, my full name is John Talmadge Webb. Most of my friends call me Tal, T-A-L, which is a short of my middle name. I'm also known as J.T. Webb, which is how I sign most of my letters. Yeah.
Let's start, since you're native to Florida, which is unusual from all the people that I've interviewed so far. Let's start a little bit about your background in Florida, and then your education, and let's move on then to your missile-related
Okay.
employment.
I was born in Miami, Florida, to a pioneer family there. I went to Edison High School, all the way from elementary, junior high, and high school, which was the second school in Miami. I went to the University of Florida, took a degree in Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, graduated after a 2-year stint on a nuclear refining plant up in Wakefield, Ohio, where I got married. Came back to school in 1955 and graduated in January of '59. And my family at that time was my wife, who was also a native Floridian, born in Miami, and 2 children, and we headed in an old Plymouth out to California, where I had my first job after graduation with Douglas Aircraft.
How'd you get the job?
Well, you know, we had interviews at school, and I went to several interviews and got, at that time, I got about 5 or 6 different offers. And Douglas paid the most money. Also, I loved airplanes, and so I thought maybe I'd be able to work on the DC-6 or the DC-7 that was coming up. As it turned out, I was hired in the missile side of Douglas at Clover Field in Santa Monica, working on the Thor propellant transfer system. I was assigned to the RP-1 system and did some of the design work to transfer from storage tanks to the Thor through various valve complexes into the bird. And I worked there for about 1.5 years. On April Fool's Day, McDonnell Douglas in 1960 wrote a memo to all salaried employees that they would have to have a 10% cut in pay. Well, being a poor student, just starting work, I couldn't afford a 10% cut in pay. So I looked for another job and got hired by General Dynamics on the Atlas activation program, putting their E-Series Atlases in coffin sites in Spokane, Washington, where I was a design liaison engineer. And I was one of 2 mechanical engineers on the site that handled all of the changes and all of the responsible for the testing of the propellant loading system for the Atlas. We completed that job, and then I moved to Abilene, Texas, where we were putting E-Series Atlases in silos. And I was associate engineering supervisor on a site, and I was completely responsible for all the engineering, all the installation that was there. In addition to that, I was consultant to the Air Force representing General Dynamics during the construction phase of the silo sites. Worked with Fluor, who were the contractors, and it was a fun job because as an Air Force consultant working for the Air Force, I could go out and inspect something. If I didn't like it, then I could write myself a letter as the representative from General Dynamics and says, you need to go fix this. And I never had an argument with myself. It was something that was really neat. So after we got going and I finished the silo work, I was a test conductor for what we call dual propellant loadings, where we sold off the site to the Air Force. And I did about 3 or 4 of those. About that time, my wife and I wanted to go back to Florida. So I applied for a job with McDonald, who was working Mercury program, and they hired me as an environmental control system engineer. And I went to work for them in July of 1962. And I worked on the Wally Schirra's shot, the next to last shot of the Mercury program. as an environmental control system engineer. And coming from the Atlas program, I was used to long hours, and we sure got long hours on Mercury too. I can remember several times when I worked double shifts because we hadn't finished a test. One of the things I had to do when I arrived there was, besides learn the system I was working on, was get qualified for the altitude chamber, because the ECS engineers sometimes had to ride the chamber when we were checking out our cabin control valves and our pressure control valves for the oxygen breathing systems. And that was something I'd never done before, was ride an altitude chamber, and it was an interesting thing.
What's it like?
What was it like?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what they did is they evacuated the chamber down to below almost space conditions, where we could check out the settings of our cabin vent valve, which would vent as the rocket went up and Mercury was put into altitude. The cabin pressure was kept at about 5 psi. And of course we had to check out the breathing oxygen system, which was 100% oxygen. And they used a low PSI for that because at altitude, when you go up above 14,000 feet, the alveoli of the lungs absorb oxygen at about a partial pressure of 5 psi. So that's why we could use a low pressure, which saved weight. And so I had to learn all of that kind of thing and learn the systems, and then we were responsible for checking out the systems and calibrating the checkout gauges. We used Heisey gauges, Wallace and Tiernan gauges, and manometers to check the various set levels of the valves and regulators that were used to control the environmental control system. And it was, you felt like you were really doing something good, even though you were working long hours. Here we were in a space race, but it was something that you knew could benefit all of mankind, not just the United States, even though that was important. And you were making history almost every day. That was one of the attractions of the space program that caused me to be interested in joining it. So we went through Wally Schirra's shot, and then we started working on the next capsule, which was Gordon Cooper's long duration shot, 22 hours, and to check out one day in space to see how it affected the human body. And I worked with people that Bill Yeeke was the lead engineer when I signed on, and Jerry Burbling was another lead engineer that I worked with. Jim Walker was there. My first boss was Bryce Keith, all of McDonald. We finished the program with Gordon Cooper's launch. And then we went into a hiatus, but those of us who were on the test team got transferred to the Gemini program. And
I wonder, before we get into Gemini, if I can back you up a little bit. And there's some areas that I'd like to ask you about.
Okay.
You had mentioned that when you got your job with Douglas, that you had really hoped that you could be in aircraft. Yeah,
I did, because I've always been interested in flying. I'm a private pilot, and it was just something that I had dreamed about, I guess. Mm-hmm. But the missiles were fun to work on too, so it worked out okay. I was doing something I enjoyed.
Did growing up here in Florida, even though it's South Florida, did you, with the missile shots that are going on here from 1950, were you following them at all? Were you interested in it?
Oh yeah, I did. Of course, we watched the Explorer program, and we watched the Vanguards and saw some of the problems we were having, and then the Jupiter launches finally, and the Redstones, where we put the first suborbital flight. So that was all interesting to us. While we were still working, I worked 16, 18 hours a day on the Atlas programs, but I still followed the space program. Mm-hmm. It was something I wanted to do.
Well, when you make the transition from Douglas to Convair, compare the two companies to work for.
Well, I really liked working for Douglas. It was a good company. The people I worked for were very responsive. I can remember as a young engineer who thought you know, I was pretty hot stuff. I found a problem with stratification of the RP-1 tank, which reduced the range of the Thor missile in one of my analyses. And I went to my bosses and told them, hey, I found this, we need to let the Air Force know. And they say, well, now wait a minute, we can't do that. And I remember pounding the table with Sam Rafiti, my boss's boss, sitting there and saying, well, we got to do this because of, we're looking for an impact, and we really impact the point where the missile lands by this stratification. We got to come up with some way to solve it and let the Air Force know. Well, they finally agreed. So I felt that I had accomplished something. That was one of the first times I had, I guess, been aggressive in pushing my viewpoint with the company. And I was new. So we got that, and then things slowed down. We got a circulation system going in the storage tank, and it came on every so often and circulated the RP-1 fuel so that we had a constant temperature across the tank instead of had it in layers where the temperature would change the density of the RP-1, and you use density for flight. So that was one of the things that I remember in that particular program. General Dynamics, it wasn't Convair. They had created another one called General Dynamics Astronautics, a division that worked out of La Mesa in San Diego. And when I was hired by them, I went and spent 2 weeks in San Diego going through all of the Atlas propellant loading systems and the logic controls that controlled propellant loading systems. And doing that, I found a couple of logic relays that were incorrect and was able to correct those before I actually went out to the site and worked at the site. So after working for a while on the coffin sites, I got promoted to a propulsion system engineer. And that was fun, because now I did a lot of loading and I was responsible for testing all the systems. And I can remember with General Medeiros came out to one of the coffin sites, and we were getting ready to erect the Atlas for the first time in this particular site. And we had an erector that had a clamshell that clamped around the Atlas, and you're probably familiar with it. It was a pressurized. It didn't have structural integrity unless you had kept pressure in the tank or you kept it in stretch. Well, when we took the clamshell, we lifted the Atlas up on a launcher and rotated it to the vertical. The clamshell sometimes had a habit of releasing. And General Medeiros came to the site I was on, and he came about the time we were starting to raise the Atlas up to the vertical position, and I politely asked him to clear the launch ramp, because he was right where if it released it would go down. And we'd had an Atlas release on another site about a month before that, and it crumpled just like stamping on Coke cans and shattered. So I was worried about the safety. Well, he was very nice. He moved out and we got our test underway. That was one of the interesting things. There was always something new that you had to solve a problem during that program.
Can you compare the Thor, to the Atlas?
Well, the Thor was an intermediate range ballistic missile, and of course the Atlas was an intercontinental range. Thor had a single engine. Atlas had 3. They had 2 booster engines and a sustainer. The booster engines were, all 3 engines were built by Rocketdyne, and the 2 boosters were 150,000 pounds of thrust, and the sustainer was about 60,000 pounds of thrust. And about 2 minutes after launch, the booster engine separated, and I had an adapter that was blown loose and it fell off and reduced weight. So it was sort of a stage and a half vehicle. And it had a common bulkhead. The common bulkhead was such that if the pressure in the tank that was on top of the common bulkhead got greater than the pressure in the tank below the common bulkhead, the bulkhead would actually implode in, and you'd have a reverse bulkhead, and that was not a good thing, because you had to go in and cut it out and redo it. So you had to keep it under pressure, under stretch all the time. So it was very interesting.
So was it more challenging?
Yeah, it was, because when I joined the Thor program, it was in nearly the final stages of its deployment. In fact, as I was made the liaison with the people installing missiles over in England, called the Emily Project. And so I was the propellant system reps to the Air Force to make sure that parts and pieces and procedures flowed to Emily in the right order. And we supported their testing. And I remember right after I was assigned that job, I got a call from the Emily people and said, hey, we need this part. It was a valve. Ours failed and there's no spares and we need to get this, and we have a test scheduled for a week. So how about expediting this part? So I called down to the manufacturing area and said, I need to get this part to England and at this time frame. And the guy says, well, you'll have to establish a priority. And I says, okay, who do I have to talk to establish a priority? And they gave me the name of somebody, and I didn't know who it was. So I called this gentleman and told him who I was and what I wanted to do, and I needed that part, and he was the one I was told could set the priority to get that work out of sequence. And about this time, my boss was standing next to me, and I mentioned the gentleman's name, and I finally got his agreement, and he did. We got the part to Emily, but my boss, after I hung up the phone, says, you know who that was? And I said, no, this guy who could set the priority that I needed to get the part out. He said, that's the vice president of manufacturing at Long Beach, which is where this was being built. So I did something that I wasn't aware of by talking above the head. I didn't go through channels, as it turned out, but I got the part there. That's what counted.
In working with these ballistic missiles, what's your feelings on the threat of the Soviet Union?
At that time?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we felt threatened. And of course, in the Atlas case, the coffin sites and the silos were all designed to withstand close proximity bursts of nuclear weapons. And of course they built that way. The control center was built on springs that took the shock of an explosion. It was completely separated from the silo itself. And we had big blast doors that closed off in the event we were hit, that it couldn't come in. Big concrete and steel doors on the silo that would pop open as you brought the vehicle into what we called the uplocks to get it ready for launch. So we knew that we were racing the Soviets, and of course we didn't know how far along they were, except they were in space before we were, which was not a good sign. They orbited their Sputnik before we got ours up. So we thought they probably were ahead of us, but we thought we were a little bit behind, and that's why we were working these inordinately long hours. And we felt like we were doing something that was important. All of the people there, including the mechanics, the engineers, the logistics people, the quality inspectors, felt like it was an important job. And the Air Force folks that we were training to take over the silos when we got them validated were very dedicated people themselves. So it was a tense time, I think, for all of us that worked in the program. And of course, about the time that we sold off 3 of the launch sites at Abilene, Texas, when we got into the problem with Cuba. And we actually got very, very close to launching. One of the things we did was keep a green board, which meant that we were within 15 minutes of launching an Atlas, if it came to that. And that's what a DPL was, to prove that we could, within 15 minutes, we could run the vehicle up to the uplocks, program it all in, get a green board, and come within 2.5 minutes of launch. That's what we strove to do. And sometimes it was creative engineering to be able to do that. There was a guidance system on board that if it got out of tolerance, you'd have to recycle. And one of the things that would affect its accuracy was one circuit breaker panel down in the bowels of the silo. And we found early on that if you didn't keep that circuit breaker cool, it would pop, and it would take the power off the inertial control system. We'd have to recycle it. So we actually ended up putting a bucket of ice in the fan during blowing cold air on that circuit breaker panel to keep it from popping during our DPLs.
What do you think of the coffins versus the silos?
The silos were certainly much more secure and really lent themselves to a more rapid deployment, because the coffin sites was a long, big slab of concrete and steel, and it slid sideways to open up the coffin so that the vehicle go to the vertical. Well, it was sometimes the clamps that held that door down would come open and then creep back closed, and so the door wouldn't completely open all the way, which is not a good sign. So that was, I had gotten ready to leave Spokane. I'd sold off my site and had my wife and my kids. At this time there were 3 kids in the car, packed, and we're heading for Abilene. And I just stopped by the base to get my paycheck, and they told me, hey, we just had a problem with the latches coming closed, and you're the only mechanical guy we have. You need to go out there. And I said, but I'm on my way to Abilene. My wife's in the car. I mean, our house is sold. I said, I'll be glad to go, but you got to put me up in a motel. And our clothes are our furniture's all on the van, already headed out. So they did, and I got in a helicopter. They flew me out to the site, and I saw what had happened and went back and did a typical fault analysis to find out what happened. It turned out the little solenoid valves that directed the hydraulic fluid were leaking, and you would command them open. They would open the latches, but the leakage was such that it would cause the valves to go closed and reverse that direction and actually put the latches back into the lock position, or partially into the lock position. So we devised a fix for that, and then after 2 weeks of staying in that motel, we got back on the road and went to Abilene.
Did you ever go to the Plattsburgh sites?
No, that's where they had me headed originally, to go to Plattsburgh, New York. But I had a buddy that was working out there, and I called him to ask him about the conditions. And he says, well, we get summer July 4th. It's winter from the rest of the time. And my wife and I, being Floridians, weren't really too keen on going to a cold, snowy country like Plattsburgh. So I asked for a different assignment and got sent to Abilene. So that was fun.
Did you run into Cal Fowler at all while you were doing any of this?
I didn't run into Cal Fowler until I got here in the Kennedy Space Center. And actually, I had thought at one time of leaving McDonald. And so I had an interview with GE at that time, and it was Cal Fowler that I went and talked to. So that's how I met Cal the very first time.
So you didn't run into him at all throughout your career with Convair, huh?
No, not with Convair. I met him down here. I tried originally to get transferred to the Atlas program, and Tom O'Malley, who was down here for General Dynamics at that time, had his full team and didn't need anybody else. And that's why I actually went to McDonald. I originally tried to transfer. When I left Abilene, Texas, they gave me 2 choices. One, go to Tullahoma and work on the Centaur, or go back to San Diego in the design section. As I said, we wanted to go back to Florida. We were tired wandering around. We'd move 5 times in about 4 years, and that was enough. Nina was getting a little anxious to get stable into a stable situation. So we did.
How about your salary from Douglas to Convair, then to McDonnell?
Always got about a 20, actually the first time I got a 25% raise to go from Douglas to General Dynamics. And then when I went from General Dynamics to McDonald, I only got about a 10% raise.
What was your starting salary with Douglas?
$5,500 a month, a year, $5,500 a year. And I thought that was a magnificent salary at the time. And I can remember talking to my wife and saying, hey, my goal is to get $10,000 a year by the time I'm 30. And I made that when I went to work for McDonnell. So it was something. I wasn't hesitant to change jobs if it became necessary, but I was usually very loyal to the company I was working for. I would never have left Douglas probably if that memo from Donald hadn't come out and asked for 10% cut in salary. As it turned out, when I went back and investigated, they lost something like 400 engineers within 3 weeks of that time.
And it was just a April Fool Day?
No, it wasn't April Fool. He was serious, but it didn't last but about 3 months, and then they reestablished or gave the 10% back. But I couldn't do it at that time. I couldn't live on that 10% cut in salary. I was still paying off school loans, and we had 2 kids and another one on the way. So that we were living in a 28-foot trailer in a trailer park. I had 2 white shirts at this time, and I would walk to work wearing 1 white shirt, and Nina would come home and she'd wash one, and I'd wear the next one to work. And we had that was how we started out in my professional career, I guess.
Did you bring that trailer to Florida?
No, I sold it out there. When I got the job for General Dynamics, I sold the trailer, and we actually rented our first house when we got to Spokane. A nice little house. And it was interesting. I can remember though when I got the job with McDonnell with the family, and we were driving into Brevard County, and we came across the 520, and of course at that time the bridges were still corduroy bridges. And we stayed at the old Vanguard Motel the very first night we were here. And we went up, and I noticed about 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the evening, people were starting to congregate on the beach. So I went down and asked the clerk at the desk what was going on. And she said, well, the rumor has it that there's going to be a launch tonight. And I think it was a Minuteman launch. And so the military was still in the secretive mode, and they didn't announce their launch times. But somehow the rumor always seemed to get around. So the family and I went out on the beach, and we waited for probably an hour, and finally the missile launched. And it blew up about, 25, 30 seconds after liftoff. And flaming pieces of solid propellant was scattered all over the ocean, and it was raining down, and my kids thought it was the best fireworks display they'd ever seen. And we knew we had come to the right place, My family was happy. We ended up staying at the Winslow Beach Apartments while we were waiting for our house to be finished.
Where'd you select to have your home built?
In Satellite Beach. And the reason we did that was the schools. We went and we investigated what we thought were the better schools in the county. Melbourne was too far away. Also, when we looked in this one particular development in Satellite Beach, the houses were in the price range we could afford.
How much?
$22,500. I had some per diem money that I just got. I had about $2,000 that we had in cash, spendable cash. And so I made a deal with the contractor who was building the home, and this happened to be the model home, and it was on a corner. It was right on the corner of Greenway and Poinciana Court. And it was just the right kind of house that we wanted. It was a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house for $22,500, and the guys were hurting, and so they wanted my $2,000 that I could pay as a down payment because they had to meet payroll. And I had made them sign a contract that this would be ready when my per diem money ran out, which was 2.5 months from the time we got there. And so, yeah, they agreed to it. We wrote it into the contract. And then Nina, we liked the schools were all within walking distance of where this house was. Surfside Elementary was just about 5 blocks down the road. Delora Junior High was about another 4 or 5 blocks away, and then Satellite High was there. And according to the people we talked to, those 3 schools were highly rated. And of course, we were interested in good education for our children.
How old were your children?
My oldest boy was 8. My middle boy was almost 7. My daughter was just 2. And so they ended up going to Surfside Elementary, and then they went from Surfside to Delora to Satellite. So we stayed there in Satellite Beach until all the kids got out of high school. And I was taking that long drive down A1A one morning in all the traffic and the construction. You know, it was only 2-lane when we first got there. And I said to Nina when I got home, I says, why are we still living in Satellite Beach? We've been there 22 years. And I'm still driving. It went from, my first job was at Hangar S and Pad 14. Then it went for Pad 17. And then I went over to KSC, and the drive got longer and longer as we went along. So I said, let's move north. And so we did. We found a small orange grove on North Merritt Island on Chris Foley Road. And the next door neighbor to this orange grove was our flight instructor. Both Nina and I had our pilot's license, and our instructor worked for IBM. At the end of the Apollo program, he got transferred to the Triangle in Raleigh-Durham. And he had right of first refusal on the lot next to him, which was a 6.5-acre little orange grove. So he gave me the guy's name, and I went and talked to him and said, hey, Ed's getting transferred. He said he had the right of first refusal, and he gave that right to me. Can we make a deal? And we did. And so we bought the orange grove, 6.5 acres there. And about a year and a half later, we built our house where we now live.
Did your wife work during the...
When the kids got into high school, she went to work as a teacher's aide. And she was a teacher's aide, and then she got special training to become an exceptional children teacher. She taught exceptional children in Delora for a couple of years.
So this would have been in the 70s? In the
70s, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
She was, I don't remember how old now, but our kids were in college, and I had 2 and 3 in college at the same time. One of them was her, and she started off getting her bachelor's degree. She got her degree, bachelor's degree at, she went to Brevard Community College first, graduated from there, then went to Rollins, got her bachelor's at Rollins, went to UCF, at that time it was FTU, and got her master's, and then went to Nova University and got her doctorate. And most of this time she was teaching full-time at Mila Elementary. And then a couple of schools down in the south end before she got transferred to Mila. And then she worked at Mila until she retired. And she was a curriculum specialist for a while, and then went back and taught 3rd grade. And she always liked science. She says, if you don't get the kids by the time they're in the 3rd grade interested in math and science, the chances are you may not ever get them. So I think that's true.
Right.
Yeah. So that's sort of the early part.
Well, when you have the return to Florida, when you lived in Miami, did you ever come up to Brevard County at all?
We drove through it. We'd go to, my dad's people were living in South Georgia, in Valdosta, Ray City, Tifton area. And so we'd come up at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, to go visit my aunts and uncles and cousins in Georgia. And we always came up US 1, most of the time. And we'd come right through Melbourne, Cocoa, Titusville. And when we hit Cocoa, we always rolled the windows in the cars up, because coming through Titusville was terrible with mosquitoes and the no-see-ums. So we knew about Brevard County from those episodes before we actually came to live here. And of course, being raised in Miami, we were used to the heat and humidity and the palmetto bugs and the mosquitoes off the Everglades. When you got a wind from the Everglades, the mosquitoes were always hurting. So we were used to that kind of thing. It wasn't as traumatic experience to us as it was to a lot of our friends who came down here from California, from Texas, never having encountered that kind of thing. Of course, the only place to buy meat was the doggone grocery on South Merritt Island. And the closest grocery store at that time was the Winn-Dixie over in Melbourne, which is where we had to go for groceries. And then about, maybe 4 or 5 months after we moved into Satellite Beach, the public shopping center right there on A1A got built, and that fixed things for as far as groceries went. But it was tough to find anything. We'd shop at Bell's in Melbourne for clothes. And every once in a while we'd go to Orlando when Nina just felt the need of a larger city. Or we'd go to Miami and do shopping in Miami, since my mother still lived there and we could always stay with her. But during those early days, there wasn't hardly time for anything, just work and sleep, as far as I go. And that was bad, because I almost lost seeing my oldest son grow up, because of the terrible time pressures that we were under at that time. And fortunately, things got better as time went on, and I was able to spend a lot of family time, particularly camping around Florida. That was one of the things we did in the fall and early spring. We tent camped, and we hit almost all of the state parks around. But we did it in the fall and spring when the weather was cool and the bugs were down. So.
When you get the job with McDonnell, this is something different because you have been working, on the actual missile before.
Yeah.
How did you wind up getting a job in the capsule?
Well, I guess they needed mechanical engineers. And a mechanical engineer is a pretty versatile background. And that's one of the reasons I took it. Because we can do hydraulics, pneumatics, we're mechanisms, we know structures and strength of materials, that kind of thing. And so my background of working all of the Atlas sites and the Thor sites were fluid mechanics, which is environmental control system. It's nothing but fluid mechanics, compressible flow. And I was a test engineer on both Mercury and both Atlas and Thor, and so I was familiar with the test routine, how you tested components. It didn't matter whether it was environmental control or propulsion. The same philosophy. You'd start with a component, you'd check it to see that it met its tolerance limits, whether it was opening or closing times, or whether it was pressure ranges or what. And then you advanced, put those modules into a system, and then you check out the system, make sure the system worked, and looked at its interfaces with other systems. And so that's what you did. We were building all these things almost concurrently. And so you were testing the hydraulic system and the ECS systems the electrical systems, the guidance systems, and of course, on Mercury, you had the in-flight positioning systems, which were concentrated hydrogen peroxide. Were very volatile and dangerous to work with. I didn't get into that very much, but we knew about them. We knew we had to use those. And Clay Flynn was the guy who worked that on Mercury program. Then when we went into the Gemini program, instead of using concentrated hydrogen peroxide, we used hypergols. The difference between the unmanned program and the manned program was the amount of redundancy that we had, almost all triple redundancy, and the amount of reliability that we had to build into the system. Because you didn't want to fly a manned mission with the 95% reliability rate that we had on the unmanned. You wanted it up in the 99 point some percent reliable. So that was the main difference. We had to be, the tolerances for the engineering tolerance for a small out of tolerance was less in the manned program than it was in the unmanned program. We could change the range. We would be more willing to change the range. Like if something cracked at 1.5 and that was the upper limit, if it cracked at 1.55 or 1.6 on the unmanned, we might buy that as acceptable. You wouldn't do that so much on the manned program. You wanted it precise. And so that was the big difference. We were really constantly aware of the man that would be riding this vehicle and the capsule up. And we wanted to do everything in our power to make sure it was safe. That's when safety really started to become extremely important, was when we got the man in.
Did you interact much with the astronauts?
On Mercury and Gemini, we did. In fact, that was really one of the high points. The astronauts would come back after each mission, and we would have a chance to sit down with them and talk to them directly, face to face. How did our systems work? What kind of gripes do you have? What would you like to see changed? And then we'd get their comments, and we'd go out and try and do what they wanted. That was a good part. After the Johnson Space Center was built and NASA spaceflight moved to Johnson, we saw less and less of the astronauts right there at KSC. We had to go to Johnson Space Center for the debriefings. And so we didn't have that personal feel as much.
Which of the early astronauts sticks out best in your mind?
Well, I worked directly with Gordon Cooper and Wally Schirra because they were on the two missions I were on, and the backup astronaut, which was Alan Shepard. They were all very smart people. They were extremely intelligent. Most of them were test pilots. We didn't get into the mission specialist until later. Most of them had flown many, many hours. They were mostly fun-loving guys. I can remember the races between Gordon Cooper and Wally Schirra in their vets down the beach road. They joked. I can remember when Schirra got ready to do one of his missions. He got to the elevator that ran up the tower to get to the White Room, and he put his arms across us. I'm not going, teasing. But I sort of liked, I guess, the devil may care Wally Schirra from my personal knowledge of the early astronauts. I didn't get to see much of John Glenn because he'd already done his thing. Some of the later astronauts, like John Young, I thought he was a pretty savvy guy. And then as I got into the after the Apollo program, we got into Spacelab. I worked with some of the Spacelab astronauts, Joe Kerwin, Pete Conrad, Story Musgrave, some of those folks. All smart folks. Amazing, the intelligence of them. And they knew their engineering, their science very well. So.
I'm going to pause you just for a second, because
okay.
Over there is just. I wonder if you could comment on the McDonald culture a little bit, you know, Old Man Mac and everything.
Well, that was a unique culture. I didn't really get into it until I got on the Gemini program. And on the Gemini program, we had two teams, test teams, an A and a B team. And we would alternate going to St. Louis and following the Gemini capsule through its manufacturing phase and its initial test and checkout phase in St. Louis, and then following it to Kennedy Space Center, not Kennedy at that time, it was still over on the Air Force side, but following the capsule back to Cape Canaveral and checking it out. And when we got there, it was amazing. Mr. Mack would come and walk through the area, talk to people, say how things were going, do that kind of thing, and it was unusual because, and it was different from Don Douglas Jr., who I had never seen, only in a distance. But Mr. Mack would come and see how things were going. It was the attitude that we had there that this was important work. And it was something that we needed to do and needed to do well. Mr. Mack took care of his people. His pay policies weren't quite as liberal as the other two outfits that I worked for, General Dynamics or Douglas at this time. For example, we worked a terrible amount of overtime, unpaid, on Mercury and Gemini. And it wasn't until we got about a third of the way through the Gemini program that they started paying us for overtime. The union people were getting paid overtime, but the engineers weren't. We got, as I recall, if we worked Saturdays, we got $2.50 for lunch, and if we worked Sundays, we got something else, so not much. But that changed. They finally caught up with the rest of the aerospace outfits about partway through the Gemini program, and they got better.
And what is an average day for you, during Gemini?
Oh, golly. Worked double shifts quite frequently, never less than 12 hours. There were only two of us, generally, that were checkout engineers, and we'd split shifts. And sometimes we'd get a third party, and then you'd work 9-hour shifts, 10-hour shifts. But during the time when things were real stressful and we had more than one capsule there, we'd split 12-hour shifts, and then you'd have to tie in and tie out at the end and beginning of each shift, and the 12 hours stretched to about 14. So it was long, but we didn't, it was hard on the family, because my wife only saw me when I came in to eat dinner or go to sleep. And that was the mode that we were in. And even on the early Apollo program, that was the same mode we were in. The test engineers, mechanics, we were working long hours. And you got used to it. And I was young, and I could stand it then. I can't do that now.
In that downtime between Mercury and Gemini,
Mm-hmm.
did you go up to St. Louis a lot?
Not a lot. In fact we were responsible for the ground support checkout at Canaveral. And I was a coolant engineer, and this was a change because we had an adapter now. Mercury fit with a small adapter right on top of the launch vehicle. On Gemini, we had an adapter which had all the black boxes, and the cooling for those black boxes in this adapter module. And then the capsule set on top of it. And then, so we were designing the ground support equipment to check out all of those things and to keep coolant flowing during ground tests. Now the coolant that we had was a peculiar coolant made by Dow Chemical, if I remember right, but it was susceptible to moisture. And if you got moisture into it, it started precipitating out like sand, and it would clog up all the filters. So we had to be extremely careful with that. And we had a ground coolant cart, which I was responsible for, that was built in by Fairchild in Long Island, and I spent several times up there visiting Fairchild, watching them put together the ground coolant cart, and also I was there when they delivered it for their pre-delivery checkout, where they had to prove that it could do what it was supposed to do. So, and then we spent a lot of times during that hiatus period going over the systems and learning the systems, the blueprints, the drawings, the way what each one of the valve components had to do, what it was expected of, and developing procedures for checking out the systems. And then writing the test paper to go in and do that. So that it wasn't, it was less intense at that time because we weren't doing all that major testing. But it was a learning process. And I can remember my buddy and I, he was my helper for the ground coolant system, were out working. We had designed a heat exchanger with some Tygon tube and a 55-gallon drum of heated water. We were trying to put a load on the ground coolant cart to see if it could handle the load and how its control points were. And we were out here on a Saturday doing that when I can remember that was when Kennedy was assassinated. That day we were out there, and that always sticks in my mind. It fixes what I was doing on the day Kennedy was assassinated. And then after we got closer to vehicles, the first capsule I went back to St. Louis on was Gemini 2, which was an unmanned, it was an instrumented capsule. And I can remember being there for the checkout, and during the checkout there was a side glass in the coolant system in the adapter module that was made out of Lexan, and it had crazed. It had gotten partially opaque because of the pressure in the system. And that was a worry. We were ready to ship the capsule out and didn't know whether we'd have to go in and change that Lexan fitting, which means we'd have to deservice the coolant system, go back and clean it, and do a vacuum fill, replace the component and do a vacuum fill, which would have thrown us about a week and a half or 2 weeks behind the timeline. So I was a, quote, expert on the spot to make a determination whether that Lexan sight glass had to be replaced or not. And I can remember in my investigation of that particular piece, Lexan was an acrylic kind of thing, very strong, and it relieved its internal stress by crazing. And my final conclusion was that it's already seen the full pressure, it crazed, it relieves the stress on it, it's not leaking, that I gave it a 90% chance of flying. And because this was an unmanned mission, remember I said that our tolerance for change were greater, we accepted that. I wrote what we call a problem report, and we accepted it for flight with that crazing. So that was, then we went back 2, and then after 2, the other team was in St. Louis, and I was at the Cape. And then on the next capsule, I was in St. Louis, and my family would go with me. We'd load up, and because it was 3 or 4 months at a time.
Really, you want the children in school?
Well, we'd take them out of school and put them in school in St. Louis. So there we were. The first place we stayed was an apartment in Florissant. And it had a basement, and we were in a compound with a bunch of the others from the Cape who had come up to work on that program. And so we stayed there, got that ready, and went back to Kennedy Space Center. And then we got into tight launch mode that we didn't do so much traveling anymore after the first 2 or 3. And we were busy most of the time right there at the Cape.
How were the relations with the Martin Company?
Were good. Martin Company was responsible for the Titan, which was the booster, and of course our adapter sat on top of the booster. The only times that we had any trouble at all with the Martin Company is when sometimes we'd be in an elevator and we'd get a sniff of hypergalls, and the hypergalls were toxic stuff, but we didn't know how toxic at the time, and sometimes they'd be carrying buckets of stuff that they had flushed out of the hyper system down on the elevators with us, and that gave us concern for a while, and then finally we got more safety conscious of that. But the Titan folks were very, very good at their work and their job. The thing that gave us the most trouble, as I recall, was the erector. When they got ready to erect the Titan and then move it back out of the way, the thing was failing. It was part of their ground support equipment. Thank goodness I didn't have to work on that. But that was a troublesome thing. It caused a lot of delays. The Titan, I believe, was a more reliable booster than the Atlas at that time. Atlas had the problem with its structural integrity. The trouble with the Titan was the hypergalls, which was two hazardous things. But the Martin people were good. We had a good interface. We were all in the same blockhouse, locked down. In fact, as one of the guys that was a manufacturing manager for Martin lived right down the road from us, and we'd stop and talk to each other when we walked, and he was a nice guy. Joe Verlander was.
I interviewed Mr. Verlander.
Yeah, Joe Verlander was the head of the Martin folks during this time. Very, very sharp individual. Very, very good manager, I thought. So I knew Joe.
Were there any females working for McDonnell at this time?
You know, I don't think so. Not as engineers. We had females that did some of the clerical positions and some of the project management positions as administrators, but I can't recall any female engineers at all during either Mercury or Gemini. But that could be my faulty memory, but I just don't remember any.
How about minorities?
Very few. We had minorities, mostly in the tech ranks, but there were, I can't remember but one that was an engineer during that time frame. But it could be I just never ran across them. Although Mercury was pretty small, we knew most of the folks that worked Mercury, and same way with Gemini.
I'd like to discuss perhaps some of the specific flights that you were associated with Gemini.
Okay. I was coolant engineer, ECS engineer on Gemini 2 was the first flight I was on, which was unmanned. And then I was on the rest of them as a coolant system supervisor or group leader through Gemini 6 when it aborted. And about the time that I had been working all of this, I was starting to feel I wanted to get back into larger engines. And so I had my next door neighbor worked for Douglas on S4 at that time, and he was looking for mechanical engineers. They said that Douglas was looking for mechanical engineers. And so I wanted to get back into the propulsion and the engine business. So I had put in my application and I got hired. And my leave date was set to be after the launch of Gemini 6. Well, Gemini 6 had the abort. That was Wally Schirra's, another one of his shots. And So we had to resequence the launch. And about that time, Gemini 7 was coming along, and we launched Gemini 7 before we launched Gemini 6. But I left McDonnell at that point in time and went to work for Douglas. 2 weeks later, McDonnell bought Douglas, and so now I was back with McDonnell Douglas. I tried to get my time bridged, but they wouldn't do that. So I lost 3.5 years worth of working with McDonald on my pension because I couldn't get it bridged, even though now it was the same company. But I, I recognized, I knew that was going to happen.
Do you have any idea that Douglas was going to,
No, not at that time. I didn't have any idea. I didn't know there was any discussions going on between McDonnell and Douglas. Douglas was in financial straits at this time because they kept pushing the DC-7 while Boeing had gone out and developed the 707, the first jet. And the airline companies, where Douglas was being sort of autocratic, it was sort of like Ford. You can have a Ford any color you want except black, as long as it's black. Now, Douglas was saying you can have anything you want as long as it's DC-7. Well, Boeing came along with the 707, which was considerably faster and was the new thing on the block. So Douglas got in a financial bind at that time, and because Douglas Sr. and Mr. Mack had been friends, Mack bought Douglas. So there I am, I'm back working for McDonnell Douglas, and now it's on the S4 off pad 34 at that time, and I was working on the propulsion system, which included the engine, and of course this was a LOX hydrogen system. And so now cryogenics was back in play. I'd worked with liquid oxygen a lot. I hadn't worked much with liquid hydrogen. Found out that was a tough system to work in because the molecules were so small that we had a lot of leakage problems until we got the right seals. I can remember trying to do propellant loadings and going out with wet diapers, wrapping the wet diapers around the flange joints to seal it so we could transfer the fluid. And so we learned how to use all the foibles of hydrogen. Do we have a problem?
No, it's over there.
Okay.
I was worried. I thought maybe did I put the same tape in? I was looking and I'm like, no, I'm sorry.
Okay. You look concerned right there. Yeah, I can understand why.
I did. I was, because I said, I swear I put that thing over and I had an extra there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I started working the S4 on pad 34. And I was hired as a mechanical engineer, but a propulsion engineer based on my work with Thor and with Atlas. And
what do you think of the concept of the Saturn V? I mean, you had worked on Thor, then you moved up to Atlas. And
it was the next step because we needed the boost to get up there, and so a multi-stage rocket was the way. The Atlas was a stage and a half, and the Titan was a 2-stage. So this was the next step up. So when you figured you had the Boeing stage, the S1, and then the Rockwell stage, which was the S2, North American, and then the S4, the IU, and then you had the command and service module and the LEM tucked in by itself. So it was the next stage up, and it was fascinating to work on those things. Boeing was in control of the actual LOX and LH2 loading systems because they had so much to load into the S1 and the S2. So they had the ground propellant carts, and then we interfaced with them on swing arm 7 and 6 to load our stage, and we worked very closely with them. So this is where you had two competitors, really, Boeing and Douglas, McDonnell Douglas, working as a team to get the loading done of the propellants on board.
For the McDonnell Douglas workers, they had the capsule on Mercury and the capsule on Gemini. How was
Yeah.
it for them that when they're going into Apollo, they have, nothing to do
with the spacecraft.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was a big blow. And fact is, there was a lot of consternation about that. Most of them had families here, and their families have been growing up. They worked through Mercury and Gemini. Mr. Mack took care of them. He went to Titusville and built a plant. And the plant was Dragon missiles, anti-tank weapons. And he did that specifically to keep his team together. And most of the Gemini people, particularly the ones that came from St. Louis originally, gravitated over to that plant and worked there all the way from the time it was started until they actually closed the plant here years after the Apollo program was over. Fact is, my boss, George Rowe, went over there and he worked on fluidics valves as a researcher. A bunch of the folks that were in ECS went over there. Those of us who wanted to keep close to the space program went to work for one of the contractors that were on the space program. A lot of people went to work for North American, or Rockwell at that, and I went to work for Douglas, as I said. There was a little bit of cultural difference between the MacTac folks. They were very loyal to McDonald. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave that company. A lot of it had to do with their pensions. But I think on a whole they were loyal to Mr. Mack. Douglas was a great outfit. I enjoyed working for them. As I told you before, I'd probably still be working for them if it hadn't been for that one memo. So I stayed with them for 13 and a half years after I went to work for them on the Apollo program. The same concern for the man, the same safety concerns were the same on all the companies that I had associated with. And I dealt with Boeing. I dealt with North American because we sat on top of them. I dealt with the spacecraft folks because they sat on top with us. And I dealt with the IU folks because they were the computers, and everything we did had to go through the IU. And when we were doing some of the original testing of the stages, Douglas had a low bay work platform where we took the S4B and put it in a work stand right in the low bay of the VAB. We had a little control room up above on third floor of the tower. We did a lot of our subsystem testing there, which was an advantage to us that the S1 and the S2 didn't have as far as the launch vehicle goes. They had to wait until they got into the VAB and got mated before they could do very much subsystem testing. We could do almost all our subsystem testing in the low bay, and it gave us a leg up on solving problems. One of the things that I did, the propulsion system was so dynamic. In the time we were there, we must have, the first S4B stage that we processed, we changed the complete propulsion system 3 times before we got it out to launch. And the thing about it that was so massive with all of the joints in there, the one thing we had to keep track of was, had we done a complete leak check of the systems, all the systems, including the engine systems, and the pneumatic systems and the cryo systems, as well as the APU systems. So one of the things that I did while I was there, which was something, I did a PERT chart flow. I took all of the tasks that we had to do and I laid them out on a timeline. And each joint was assigned a number. And as we did a leak check of that joint, we would color in that number. It was in a little circle on this big sheet that rolled out. And so what I had done is I'd gone through and I had taken the times it took to do each one of the subsystem tests or each one of the component tests, and I overlaid it together to match our personnel assignments. In other words, we had so many engineers, so many techs, so many quality people that we could utilize at any one time. So I laid all those things out in the right relationship to one to another so I could see what the critical flow was through the system. And so I could see what systems could be done in parallel without interfering with others. And so we started that on the first Saturn V system launch. We started this particular leak check regime, component check regime, and keeping track of it because the ops guys, Barney Brown, have you ever heard of Barney Brown? He's passed away now, but he was the ops manager for McDonnell Douglas on the Saturn program. He was responsible for scheduling and making sure the scheduling was adhered to. Well, Barney was always coming to us that we're checking out the propulsion system, wanting to know where we were and how much progress we'd made. So I just kept this big scroll on one of the work tables in the low bay, and he could come up and look and see exactly where we were. And so it was easier for us to keep on schedule, knew what work we had to do. But the fact is we changed everything out 3 times. The very first launch, I was still doing the last leak checks on the first day of the launch count.
Is that the Saturn V and 67?
Yeah.
The first one?
First one. So we knew all that. It was safety, and then time constraints, and then reliability. Those were all 3 things that had to work together during these time frames.
When the first Saturn V goes off, the unmanned one, what were your thoughts?
I thought we finally got it off the ground. I tell you, it was a relief, exhilarating. You were exhilarated because it worked. Number one, it was successful. There's a first launch success with really no failures. And you were relieved that nothing went wrong. And you thought, well, hot dog, we made history today when that launched. And now we're on our way. It took so long to get through. On one of the countdown demonstration tests where we did the first propellant loading, it was scheduled to take about 24 hours. It lasted 2 weeks and we never finished it because we had LOX leaks, we had hydrogen leaks, we had failures of pumps. We stayed on console 32 hours straight one time. And during that 2-week frame, I would bring my sleeping bag in the back of my station wagon, and when I could get off console, I would go and nap right there. And a lot of us did that during that time frame. We tried for 2 weeks to complete that particular test, and we never finished it. We had to abort that. We had to go back and do a lot of major rework on the pads, particularly in the propellant transfer systems. One of the problems we had was seals. The seals we were using on the big transfer lines were partially Teflon. We found out why they were leaking. We did a test. The seals, the first set of flanges that we had to seal the 2 pieces of pipe together, were spiral. They did rings around where the seals we put in would compress, and these rings were supposed to seal it. But they were made in spiral. And so there was a leak path all the way through. So we had to redesign the flanges to make them concentric rings on each flange. And then we did a lot of testing on the seal material. And we found out that the Teflon was cold flowing. And we were losing the grip of the flanges because the seals would cold flow and the torsion on the bolts would relax. So we went, that was one of the big things that we had to learn. So we changed all the flanges. We went through and we changed to a different seal material, something called Fluorogold at that time. And they had a metal band around it as well as the Teflon in it. And this was the solution for the relaxation of the torque on the bolts that held the flanges together and the leak path, those 2 changes. That was something that took us a while to discover. So we did that. We also had trouble with hydrogen sensors. We had hydrogen sensors all along the pipelines. And it turns out these hydrogen sensors were very susceptible for going off when there was even no hydrogen leaks. So, and we had a lot of holes because of that. When the sensor would go off, we had to assume it was a leak. We'd have to take a hydrogen sniffer up there, and we'd sniff to see if we really had a leak, and we found out we didn't. We'd have to replace the sensor. And so we had to work out how to make those things more reliable. But generally, the Apollo program, the Saturn V program, was a marvelous program. Never a failure of one of those launches.
Where were you on the first launch?
On the first launch.
Mm-hmm. The unmanned.
Okay, I was the pad propulsion engineer. I was out on swing arm 6. I did the final closeout of the aft compartment. Did all the checks from propulsion and the engine work, and was there when we put the hatch on, sealed the hatch. And then after I did that, I went back to the firing room and worked with the console. I was on a strip chart at that time. And then to make sure that we didn't have any leaks, and if we had to go back in, I had a crew that I'd go back in on the pad and go back into the aft compartment if we had to replace something or change something. So, but I was in the firing room. And then as each launch progressed, I got more experience, and so I became what they call C4PC, which was propellant console. I manned the console for the launches up through Apollo 11. And after Apollo 11, I was approached to become a test conductor based on my test conductor experience with the Atlas program. Now here I had to make, this was one of the key decision points in my professional life. I've been an engineer all along, and now I was being requested to go from engineering into what we call operations. And I agonized over that probably for a week before I finally accepted to go into the test conductor business. And the test conductor at that time was sort of unique. Just like it says, we orchestrated the way in which we tested the vehicle systems. We had to know a little bit about every system on board, because when one system couldn't test because of a problem, we had to know enough to sequence in another system that could work in parallel without interference. We wrote the launch procedures. Test conductors wrote the launch procedures. And the integrated procedure, where we brought all of the pieces together in the right order, in the right sequence, so we were ready at the proper time. We worked very closely with our counterpart test conductors, the Boeing test conductor, the North American test conductor, the spacecraft test conductor, and the NASA conductors. We had Norm Carlson. Have you ever had a chance to talk with Norm Carlson?
Briefly.
Yeah. Norm Carlson was what we call CLTC. He was the NASA launch conductor for the vehicle systems there. And so we did a lot of work with them. We got all the S4B stuff ready, and we wrote those procedures, and we integrated in this integrated procedure, which was a written timeline from the time we started countdown until the time we lifted off. And it was a book that was, I don't know, 2 volumes worth, a very thick book that had the timeline and when things were supposed to be done. We also had Gantt charts which showed the flow. But this procedure that we wrote was where we integrated all of the systems together on all the vehicles, including the IU. And speaking of the IU, when we first started the test, one of the big holdups of the test was the IU and its interface with the ground checkout equipment. Something was always failing. And one of the things, when we got ready to start a test, Norm Carlson or one of the other CLTCs, Tip Talone, would come on and they'd ask us for a go. Each test conductor down this row of consoles, which were just in front of the NASA launch conductor consoles, would touch base with us to see if we were ready to go, and we'd have to either give a go or a no-go. And as we got closer to the start of the test, we did what we called foot shuffling to see who was going to admit to a problem first. And we always could count on the IU to come up and give us an extra little bit of time. So all of us test conductors were up there, were sort of looking sideways at the other guys to see who was going to have to call a hold, and that was, in the early testing, it was the IU that generally did that. And you couldn't do any testing without the IU because all the commands went through it. So, and that was an IBM interstage.
How much of a salary increase do you get now as you're coming up to be test conductor?
How much salary?
Salary increase. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I got a 5 or 6% raise, I think, for going into that. So it was good, and it was that's something I really started to enjoy. I got away from pure engineering. I had to know enough engineering to ask the right questions to the system engineers that were manning all the consoles. We had about 150 people in the firing rooms when we were doing this. And, all engineers of all kinds, and you had to know enough to ask the right questions to make sure they were telling you all the things that were really happening. Sometimes the engineers, including me, would have a tendency to hedge a little bit sometimes. So you had to know enough to be able to ask the question so they couldn't hedge and not give you a straight answer. And it was fun in the fact that now we were putting all the pieces together. I'd worked on one system, an important system, but it was only one of the many systems on the Saturn. So now my job was to make sure they all integrated together. That was the test conductor's job. And there were 4 of us in the test conductor office. And we worked for a guy by the name of John Bennett, who is now deceased. But we were the guys that had to work with the engineers to make sure everything fit together in the right way. And then during test time, we orchestrated the test. We could shut a test down if we had to. We could start one up if we had to. We had test conductor was a pretty powerful control position during those time frames.
And what years are you in this position?
From after Apollo 11 until the end of Apollo-Soyez. And so as I got better at the job, I got more responsibility. And we had a really good team, and we worked well with the ops guys, the ops engineers who were responsible for scheduling. But I was fat, dumb, and happy. I was the prime launch conductor for the S-4B on Apollo 15. And then we went on through, right after that, Spacelab was starting up.
SkyLab?
SkyLab, yeah, SkyLab was starting up. And Douglas was building the SkyLab, which was a modified S-4B stage in Huntington Beach. And my friend Ron Shane, who was my counterpart in the ops world, had transferred over to SkyLab at the end of the Apollo-Soyez program. And so he was working that, and I was still being a test conductor over on the Saturn V side. And they had their first test of the SkyLab out in Huntington Beach, and things didn't go right. Things didn't go right. So I got a call from Bill Duvall, who was the head of Douglas here at KSC. And he says, I want you to go out to Huntington Beach and pull all this testing together. So he yanked me and he yanked Ron Shane and sent us to Huntington Beach with 24 hours notice. And
how long were you there?
We were supposed to only be there 3 months. But we were there from January until after Labor Day. And at the time we were transferred, I got Bill Duvall that said, hey, when school is out, I want to bring my family out, and so did Ron. And we got out there and we started learning the systems. of the SkyLab. And, you know, there were a lot of experiments, so we had not only to learn the systems embedded in the S4B stage, the SkyLab stage itself, but we had to learn all of the experiments that went on, the ultraviolet cameras and all of the rotating litter chairs and all that good stuff, because now our task, we were assigned to go do this and pull together what we call the integrated systems test, which was where we put everything together. We'd already checked out all of the components, all of this separately. We checked out all the experiments separately. Now we had to put them all together and prove that they worked as a complete system. And of course, here we were, and I particularly had no knowledge of SkyLab and the experiments in particular. So Ron and I divided up the task. I'd take all the mechanical tasks, and he would look at the electrical tasks. We didn't have an office. We didn't have any staff to support us at the time. So we reported into a fellow by the name of Bob Tiedemann, who was the manager of test operations there. And our supervisor was a fellow by the name of Jim Firpo. So I went to Bob, and I was the lead guy, and I said, "What do you want us to do?" And he told us. And I said, "Well, we need some support." And he said, "Here's my credit card. You go get what you need." So Ron and I first started looking for a room. We found a vacant office that had enough room in it, and so we established that as our headquarters. It had no furniture in it at all. We went down to the loading dock the next day, and we got there just as a big truck was unloading some office furniture. And I went up to him and I said, "I want these transferred up to room so-and-so. And I want 3 desks, a drafting table, and a couple of work tables." And so, okay, I signed my name and gave him the credit card, and within a day we had furniture in that room. And this is just the two of us going off and doing these things. So we got a room, and we got a staff guy by the name of John Maddie, who worked the internal workings. He knew who to go to. We met Terry Smith, who worked all of the Spacelab procedures. He was the head of the procedure group that were writing all the test procedures for this. And so we started with a roll of graph paper. We started at one side of that room, and we went all the way around the 3 walls of the room with this graph paper, and we started laying out the timeline. First of all, we had to decide how many mechanical, how many technicians, electrical, how many QCs, and how many engineers were available to do all this testing work. And once we did that, then we could man load so that we always had the right amount of people at the right times to go do this. And we integrated this whole thing on those 3 walls, and I think about 2 weeks, 3 weeks after we got there, Bob Tiedemann came walking into the room, and he looked at all this stuff on the wall, and we had it all laid out, and he asked me, he says, "How long is it going to take?" And I said, "It's going to take at least 3 weeks." And he says, "You only got 2 weeks." And I said, "It's going to take at least 3 weeks." And he says, "Okay, so we're going to test 3 shifts a day, around the clock." And so all the time we're building this, we had other duties as assigned, like running tests on these various components, the experiments and stuff. Also, that's the time I met the head of the astronaut office there, who later became head of the director of NASA. Name will come to me in a minute. Dick Truly. He was a resident astronaut out there, so we had to liaise with him, and because we needed the astronauts there for different points of the test. So it took us all this time till we got and started the test in August, the last part of August. And we had a pre-test briefing in the cafeteria. There must have been 200 or 250 people in this pre-test briefing. And Ron Shane and I got up and we briefed the sequence of the test philosophy. We had to make sure we didn't tear down a test setup before we had the data reduced to make sure we didn't have a problem. So we had a whole room full of data charts, strip charts for data analysis. John Maddie was the guy who was responsible for making sure that happened. And so we started in on the test. And like I said, it took exactly 3 weeks to finish. And we split the shifts. I was first shift test conductor, Ron was second shift, and another fellow was third shift test conductor. And we went 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day for 3 weeks straight to get this all systems test completed before we could ship the Spacelab down to Kennedy Space Center.
I'm going to pause here just for 1 second. I need to change out that
A
one.
little earlier than that, because now what we had, once we got SkyLab down here, we had the Douglas Huntington Beach philosophy of doing testing and work, and we had the McDonnell St. Louis testing, which had the workshop, the orbital workshop and the telescope. Now we had to mate all those together. Now the two cultures were completely different as far as the way we did work or had work paper, and so we had to integrate all of that. We had a little difficult time getting, so we talked to each other the right way and we knew what the interfaces were. Fortunately, I knew some of the people from St. Louis that were down, Bob Graham for one, who had been part of the Mercury Gemini test teams. I knew some of those people. So we dealt with those, and we finally established ground rules and interfaces and from the test team. And we started doing the whole thing. We did component testing, we did subsystem testing, and then we did all system testing, put everything together. And we were working directly with our NASA counterparts. We had several NASA test conductors.
How was the relationship between the differences dealing with some of the Marshall people, because they were so...
Marshall people had something completely different. The Martin people, Marshall was used to working with Martin Marietta because they built the boosters and some of the engines. But it was hard to get those 3 groups together. And you had the launch vehicle experience. What happened at the end of Apollo program, all the spacecraft folks, NASA type, moved to the launch vehicle side, and the launch vehicle folks sort of moved to the spacecraft side for some reason. I don't know why that was, but it seemed to be the case. So we were working with, as a launch vehicle person, I was working with spacecraft people from our NASA counterparts, and we did things differently. So we had to do some interface testing and agreeing of how we were going to work together, because as a contractor I worked for the NASA folks. They were the overseers and the final say in what we did, so you had to establish a good working relationship with the folks. And so we did that. We had some good working relationships. And we put all this stuff together, and there were some things that we couldn't test very well, which were the panels that were on the side of the Spacelab. We couldn't really deploy those very well because it was zero G. They had to have 0G. So we put all this thing together, and I was the third shift test conductor at the start of the launch sequence. Ron Shane was second, and Bill Hoskins was the first shift test conductor on the SkyLab launch. And so we started in, and it turned out my shift was the closeout. I did all the closeout of the vehicle, and we did that. And we at that time we lost a tool. You know, every time we took tools in and out of the SkyLab, they had to be logged in and they had to be logged out to verify we carried everything out that wasn't supposed to fly. Well, when we got ready to put the hatch on, the final close hatch, there was a hammer that was missing. And now, dilemma, what do we do? So I called the tech who had the hammer, talked to him on the OIS system, He was a tech I trusted. He said, I took that out, I failed to sign it out, but it's out. I talked to the ops guys, yeah, sent some quality guys in to take another look around, we didn't find anything. So then I accepted the closeout. Based on the fact of those 3 things that were done, I was convinced we were safe to close. So we did that, because we were running the timeline. Timeline was very critical. So, but we closed out on time. And I can remember George Page coming by, wanting to know what rationale I had used to close out Spacelab when that hammer hadn't been signed out. Now I gave him this thing and he says, okay, do you trust the guy? And I said, yeah, I trust him. And so we bought that, but I got chewed out a little bit for exceeding my authority. But I found in my career that it's better to ask forgiveness than permission when you're doing something. And I've operated on that philosophy from the very time I started my engineering career. And it very rarely has failed me. So, but I did get chewed out a little bit for doing that. But we got it closed and we went through the launch, and that's another relief. There's, you talk about milestones. The first Mercury launch I was on was a milestone. The first manned Gemini launch I was on was a milestone. The first Saturn launch was a milestone. Apollo 11 was a milestone. These are stages that I always, in my career, I look at as stepping stones, milestones. And then this SkyLab launch was here we were going to put the first manned station in orbit and do long-term experiments. Long-term, and not only looking for pure science, but also physiological experiments on the astronauts. And yeah, amazing thing. Here we were finally doing it. And one of my desires was always to have been an engineer putting together the first space station in orbit. Well, I was too old for that at this time, but then it was, I got at least vicarious pleasure in being one of those on the ground that had been inside, all in and out of the SkyLab, looked at all its systems, knew what it looked like on the inside, had done a lot towards testing it and making sure it was ready for launch. And that was very satisfying, very satisfying. And it was something my kids could relate to. They were too young to really relate to the task when I was doing Mercury and Gemini, but Saturn V and SkyLab, they were old enough to understand what it was, what kind of accomplishment it was for this whole test team to do something marvelous. And then when we had the trouble with deploying the panels, that was, to me, one of the fine hours of NASA to come up with and the contractor team working together to come up with the fix for that.
What was the mood when that was revealed?
Oh, consternation. We didn't know what had happened. We didn't know what specifically had happened, because we knew that the panels had stripped off. We knew the coverings on the panels had stripped off, but we didn't know what the conditions were at the time. And fortunately, we had some good high-definition photographs from the Air Force, and that we could tell. And so the teams went to work right then to figure out how to fix it. And heat was a problem. So the first thing was to go up and deploy the sun shield. And that took care of the heating temporarily. And then the astronauts themselves that did the EVA and cut away the wreckage and got the power panels deployed. That was another fine moment, I thought. I think was a finer moment is Apollo 13, where NASA and the flight controllers at JSC did a superb job of recovering from Apollo 13. That was one of their finest hours. And SkyLab was another one. So, it made you proud to work on something that could recover from a catastrophe. And to me, it proved man in space was very, very necessary. But
why do you think that SkyLab doesn't have the recognition by the public today?
well, for a couple of reasons, I think. One is that we were only launching replenishment missions about every 30 days or so to go up there. We were only a month at a time in the SkyLab, so the launch rate was going slower than it had before. Shuttle was coming along, and a lot of the NASA budget and the NASA attention was focused on shuttle. I think the general community probably gotten a little bit blasé about the successes we'd had in launching, and so the economy maybe had something to do with that. But we lost the imagination of we didn't capture the imagination of the public as much as we did in the moon landings. Even though we were doing really good science, a lot of things have come out of that science. But attention was now on shuttle. I really felt disheartened in the fact that we didn't try and keep Spacelab in orbit. I thought there was ways we could have done that, but we couldn't get the budget. We had actually another S4B all configured as a Spacelab, and we had enough stages that we could have put that up. We had another Saturn V, I think, that was available to put it up if we needed to. I thought we could have used the S1, you know, with the Chrysler first stage and the S4B to do the supply missions. We could have gone up there and figured out a way to refuel the station keeping thrusters. I think we could have done that. Or we could have at least figured out a way to boost it into a high orbit by using a restartable engine. The J2 was a restartable engine. Anyway, for several reasons, I think we lost the public's.
How was it for you when SkyLab came back down?
I was very depressed at that time. I thought we had lost an opportunity when it came down and burned up. It was the one negative, really, at that time that I had on the whole space program, the one negative. So from there, you know, we suffered the big layoffs. That was another negative of the space program, that we didn't have any follow-through, continuous follow-through. I was one of the lucky ones that found a job at the end of, you know, in the 72s when everybody was being laid off. In the late 70s, I got transferred over to Delta, and I worked Delta as an operations engineer for about 3 years.
Were you very concerned that you would get laid off?
Well, yes, I worried about it. I didn't worry out loud to my family. I always felt I did a good enough job that I'd get hired somewhere. But I came within 2 weeks of being laid off at the end of the program. It was because I had a friend over in Delta that I went to college with, Dale Steffi, that he saved my job. My boss on Saturn, I had, since I'd worked for Douglas 1.5 years before, my vacation time and my retirement time were 2 weeks apart. We're a year and a half apart. And so when my boss, Saturn, notified me that I was going to be laid off, I said, wait a minute. I'm within a year and a half of getting full vesting in my pension. I said, that's not right. He said, well, you're already getting 3 weeks of vacation. That means your 10 years is up. I said, I said, because I worked for Douglas a year and a half in my first part of my career, that got bridged into my vacation schedule, which is, I reached my 10 years before my retirement point comes. So I said, I need to keep working that long. He says, well, He says, I've never heard of that, and I checked back with personnel and they don't see that. And about this time, I called Dale Steffi. I said, hey Dale, you were in the same position I'm in. You worked for Douglas for a year and a half and you left the same time I did. My boss over here doesn't know it or doesn't believe it that my retirement is going to be within a year and a half, and the company rules were when you were within a year and a half of your retirement vesting period, you couldn't be laid off. So Dale called my boss and gave him the story and said, yeah, well, I was telling the truth. And Dale said, I'll take him. And so I went over as an ops engineer, Delta, and I worked there 3 years and enjoyed that part of the unmanned business. We had it was something new to learn. And while I was there, we changed from Castor 2s to Castor 4s, where we put larger solid motor boosters on what used to be the old Thor and was now Delta. So it was sort of coming home. And so I worked that, did all the scheduling for the pad activity, the spin test activity, and the hangar activity, where we did all the second stage checkout. So I did most of the scheduling and the interface with engineering and with the mechanics and the techs and the quality during that time frame.
You had mentioned milestones in your career.
Yeah.
5.
Yeah.
Which is, looking back, which particular phase are you most fond of? Found most enjoyable?
Well, I don't know. I had fun going to work in both phases. I look forward to getting up in the morning and going to work, even though it was pressure and time sensitive and all that good stuff. It was fun. I enjoyed engineering, but I knew that if I wanted to advance in management, I couldn't stay in engineering very long. So when it came to that point in time during the Saturn program where I had to make that, I told you it was an agonizing choice, and it really was, the shift from pure engineering over to the operations side. That was one of the key points in my professional career where I made that decision. As it turned out pretty good, because I ended up working on the shuttle program. After I left Delta, I went to work for Rockwell on shuttle program, and I advanced from supervisor to manager to director, second line to first line director, in charge of all of the scheduling and operations for Lockheed on the Space Shuttle. So that's how I finished my professional career as the director of ground support operations for USA. So it turned out to be a good step in retrospect. But I always considered myself an engineer, I guess. When somebody asks me what I do, I say I'm an engineer. But half of my career, probably the last 15 years of my career, were in management. But it was dealing with engineers. So it was fun. And I guess I enjoyed management. It was fun. We had different kind of problems. Scheduling problems, logistics problems that you had to work, as well as technical problems. When I went to work for Rockwell, I helped establish the launch sequence that we did. And when Rockwell lost the contract, I went to work for Lockheed and did the same thing, except as a manager instead of chief test conductor. So it was financially rewarding for me to make that choice, but I don't know that I enjoyed it anymore. I didn't enjoy it any less. It's just different kind of enjoyment. So,
is there any particular area that we haven't addressed that you'd like to make comment on?
I guess I'd like to stress the fact that during all of those years, the people working in the space program put a lot of the burden on raising children and keeping the family together on their wives. And I think the wives were sort of unsung heroes during that time. One of the things that I saw when I went from to the shuttle program was the fact that there were more females engineers coming out of the schools. And we had both more females in the engineering profession, but also in my profession. I hired the first female test conductor when I was director of launch operations, Roberta Wyrick. I hired Phyllis McGrath, who came to me from Boeing. So we had some females. We had some really super black working in the workforce. A guy that comes to my mind is worked hydraulics, super guy. Went on to become a director in USA and is now a director in USA. More and more blacks. I had females working for me as pad leaders, and I had blacks working for me as pad leaders. So that's a big change. The minorities that were coming in, both the female and the other minorities, the Latins, and the blacks in particular, Hispanics. So that's an improvement. We see more people coming out of the schools today that are diverse, and we're getting closer and closer, I think, to a more balanced workforce, because the girls are finally figuring out that they're as smart scientifically and mathematically as the men, and the only reason they hadn't done it before because of the role models that they had, which were nurses and school teachers and mothers and homemakers. And so the role model is changing. They can become successful, and they are successful in the business today. But the ones who I thought didn't get the attention they needed were the wives that kept the families together. And that's the one thing I didn't really touch on. I really value my wife. She really raised the kids, at least my oldest ones, more than I did. And the fact that they turned out good really rests in her lap is more than mine.
Did it create any tensions within your home life in the 60s?
Yeah, there was always tension, because I need to take a break a minute.
Okay. We were talking about the impact on your family life, working the long hours and everything.
Yeah, it really caused tensions, because she was, Nina, was responsible mostly for discipline. And it was tough with two teenage boys and a girl that thought she should be teenager at the time. So it put stress that way. And the fact is that we didn't have much interface for quite a long time, because I was either working or sleeping. Finally, it got to the point where I'd just take time off, and we'd do family things, and it started to get better. Also, because we had both made the decision for her to stay home while the kids were in, at least through junior high, she felt like her career as a housewife wasn't satisfying, and she wanted to go do something else. And so that put a little pressure on. And the fact is that she's an extremely intelligent lady, went all the way through her doctorate. So that was tough financially to keep three people in college at the same time. So, but yeah, it did put tension, but fortunately we were able to work ourselves around it. It took a lot of give and take. You had to give a little, and we were able to adjust to it, thank goodness. And she was very supportive. She believed in the space program. That was a good thing. The one thing I haven't touched on was the tragic events during this time frame. Was the first Apollo fire, where Gus Grissom and White lost their lives. I'd just come off third shift when that happened, and it was terrible feeling, and to do that, and we felt we hadn't done as much as we could have done to prevent that fire. You know, you thought that, Even though you couldn't think of what else you could do, you felt like you were a failure in the fact that it happened.
Even though you were more associated with the Saturday
Yeah,
Night.
yeah. It was still a loss, a feeling of loss. And here we had two brave guys who were willing to get into an untested capsule, if you will, unproven capsule, and ride it. All the astronauts that way, they were brave folks as well as being smart. That it compared with the Challenger tragedy for me. Although I knew the astronauts in the Challenger a lot closer than I did Gus or Ed. Mostly they were part of the original Cape Crusaders. The astronauts came down to support all the test activities and follow the vehicle through on shuttle. And so I got to know Dick Scobie and El Onizuka and those folks very, very well. And it was more personal when Challenger went. And then this latest one, even though I've retired, was just a terrible thing. And our hearts went out to the families for something like that. There's just no way you can imagine what it feels like as a family member to lose your loved ones. So anyway, those were the negative things. But on the whole, the space program has been a very, very big positive. Plus, I certainly would not want to curtail it or stop it. I think for the benefit of the human race, we need to go out and do more exploring in space. At least that's my opinion.
I think that's a good concluding remark, actually.